Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the third weekend of April 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll look at the attack on the Pennsylvania governor's mansion. We'll hear about the federal budget as tax day came and went, and we'll discuss the ongoing tariffs on China. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Pennsylvania Governor Mansion firebombing that took place last weekend during the Jewish holiday of Passover, it's our Kristen Smith.
This week has been very difficult for Governor Josh Shapiro and his family, and it started just a few hours after he started to celebrate the Passover Seder, marking the beginning of the Jewish holiday. And that evening, a few hours later, a man from Pembroke, which is just about 10-15 minutes away, threw Molotov cocktails into the piano room and the dining room of the governor's mansion in Harrisburg. And you were able to tune into the press conference that happened just hours after this. So can you tell us more about what happened?
Yes. So in terms of the actual events that happened, there was a man, allegedly Cody Balmer, who has been charged with the crime, who hopped over the fence, used a small sledgehammer to break a window, threw a Molotov cocktail into that window, and then broke the adjacent window, climbed into it, used two more Molotov cocktails, and then exited through a fire door, jumped over the fence, and got away. But they found him, very, very quickly afterwards, because he actually called the police to turn himself in addition to calling his ex-girlfriend and asking her to turn him in. So it wasn't, a long investigation or a very up for debate situation. We know who it was. And now we kind of have a lot of just media speculation about the motive and his frame of mind. As far as what happened from the governor's side of things, he and his family were awoken at 2 a.m. by Pennsylvania State Police. No one was hurt. They and their dogs, he has 4 children and his wife, were all able to leave the house. They also had some guests staying with them for Passover. So everyone was safely evacuated. And the governor has said several times since then that his primary focus over the past week has just been trying to, help his kids through the emotions and reactions to this event.
You mentioned the motives for the suspect's actions. I know that there's been some background information that's come out about him in the last week. Can you tell us more about his history?
Yes. So I think the number one thing that his family and also his attorneys want to focus on is the fact that he was suffering from severe mental illness that had gone untreated. So he had in the past been hospitalized and treated for schizophrenia and bipolar, is what I've read. And that's coming from his mother says that. So the thinking is that he's been off his medication for a while, leading to a really acute mental health crisis. So that is one major factor in what happened. There has been a search warrant that came out that said that he spoke about Shapiro's stance on Palestine, saying that he didn't want to be a part of what Shapiro wanted to do to the Palestinians. I have also read reports that he was, having delusions about Shapiro's stance on Palestine going beyond, Josh Shapiro does support Israel and their actions there, although he has criticized Benjamin Netanyahu and does advocate for a 2-state solution. But he has obviously indicated his support for it. But from what I'm understanding, the suspect, Cody Balmer, was talking about him eating babies and things like this that are more symptomatic of a mental crisis than a logical political ideology.
Right. And it's that those factors combined, which is why he's got many charges. Attempted murder, I think, would be among the most serious, but he's also been charged with terrorism and aggravated arson and attempted assault, because he did tell police that if he had encountered Shapiro while inside the mansion, that he would have beat him with the sledgehammer. So he's been charged with all these things, but he has not been charged with any kind of hate crime. And can you talk about more why the district attorney has declined to do that at this time?
Yes, I had an opportunity to talk to the district attorney, Fran Chardo, yesterday, and talk to him about whether they would be using in Pennsylvania, the statute is ethnic intimidation. It's not called a hate crime. And I talked to him about that. For him, it doesn't make sense to use that because what it would do in a normal crime would take it from, say, like a 3rd degree offense to a 1st degree offense. Everything that Cody Balmer is being charged with is already a 1st degree offense. It's already the maximum it could be. So if he's got 5 counts for 20 years, he's got 100 years that he's looking at. Adding that ethnic intimidation charge wouldn't add to his potential sentence or the severity of his crimes. It would only add an additional burden for the prosecution because then they have to go through proving that for really no reward there. He did say that, if the federal government chose to pursue those kinds of charges, they have their own jurisdiction, right? So they're each a sovereign place, Pennsylvania and the federal government, and they're welcome to do that if they choose to. When it comes to whether or not it would qualify as a hate crime or ethnic intimidation, we're really not sure. I don't think we have enough details there. Obviously, it happened on Passover, which is a really strong indication that the governor's Jewish faith was a factor in the timing, although we haven't heard anything about Balmer saying that specifically. We also haven't heard him saying anything about Judaism or Shapiro's faith or ethnic background. We've only heard him talk about Shapiro's political position. And I think that's something that kind of has gotten lost in discourse in general, because there are a lot of Jewish people who do not agree with Israel's actions all the time. Just like there are a lot of Americans who don't always agree with the American government. There's a distinction between nationality and ethnicity, a faith and a political position.
Right. And I think that's where the charge of terrorism is an important note, because terrorism is not the same as a hate crime here, at least in this country. And so given what he said about his position on how he disagrees with the governor's stance on Israel's actions, that doesn't equate to a hate crime, because that is that's a political disagreement, not a belief that Governor Shapiro and his family should be harmed simply for being Jewish. So that's an important distinction to make.
Yes, but it certainly does fall into the state's definition of terrorism, which is to influence a government official, to influence their decision making, to use, fear, intimidation, and harm to change the course of what the government's doing. So that absolutely is terrorism.
All right, Christina, thanks for joining us today. To keep up with this story, please follow us at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Kristen and Christina. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the federal budget, let's go to Dan McCaleb.
Tax day was Tuesday, April 15th, the deadline for the vast majority of Americans to file their federal income taxes. If you got money back, you were probably happy. If you had to cut a check to the IRS, not so much. While we have to pay taxes to pay for vital services such as homeland security, infrastructure, and other services, too many taxpayers feel the federal government has grown so bloated over the years that it's as much of a burden as it is helpful. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Taxes were due on a day when a new report came out, Casey, showing the real costs of federal debt, while the U.S. government places the debt at nearing $37 trillion. A budget watchdog group, Truth in Accounting, says the figure is actually much higher. They place federal debt at $158.6 trillion when you include government entitlement programs. Tell us about that.
Yeah. The national debt we all know is in a really a dire state. It's on track to be, $37 trillion later this year. As we talked about on this podcast before, not only the overall national debt is growing rapidly and more quickly every year, the national deficit has increased. It's not as if we've slowing our spending or tapering off to address this problem. We're actually getting into debt faster than we ever have before. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the national deficits never really topped $1 trillion. Now they often top over $2 trillion. And so the debt's growing faster. But this Truth in Accounting report, which we actually got an advanced copy of this, and it's very interesting because it throws out this whopping figure of $158.6 trillion in debt. That's a huge figure, of course. But when you read where they get it, it's not even that ridiculous when you think about it, because what they take into account is, well, don't you assume that Medicare and Social Security are going to exist for, say, the next 50 years? I mean, I think that's 75 years. I mean, I think that's a reasonable assumption. At least when you're financially planning, you should plan that these things are going to exist. To assume that Medicare and Social Security will no longer be an expense for the federal government at some future date is a pretty convenient assumption that helps your budgeting, right? So the Truth in Accounting says, well, we're going to assume that Medicare and Social Security are going to exist for the next 75 years. And if they do, then how much will the U.S. have to pay over that time? And it turns out it's a lot. It's about 51 trillion for Social Security and 67 trillion for Medicare. And so
I think those are just numbers reversed, but I think it's 51 for Medicare and 67 for Social Security, but we get the point.
Right. These huge figures for these entitlement programs over the next few decades. And so, I don't think it's really, it's not how budgeting accounting is normally done. But if you're just doing your own household income, right, and you think about how much debt do we have, you count your mortgage, even though you have to pay it out over 30 years. You don't say, well, we don't have to pay the mortgage for 30 years, so we're not going to count that in this year's debt. It's like, well, what's your overall debt? Your overall debt is all the debt you're going to owe that you've taken out loans on. And so when you can think about it that way, the national debt is actually even more scary than we realize.
There's no doubt about that. Even though President Trump, created the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, put Elon Musk in charge of it. And we're seeing, almost every week, these massive amounts of, government waste and fraud that they're identifying, for cuts. Those cuts are just, at this point, good for them. We need to trim spending, but it's really just a scratch on the surface when it comes to this, where we're at now with our national debt.
It is. And now we're seeing that Elon is probably not going to be able to hit the high estimates of cuts that he originally promised. I mean, I think there's a lot of institutional things there. I always thought that number he threw out, $1 trillion, $2 trillion, was really high.
Annually, right.
That's a lot of money. Without Congress, you really can't do that. I mean, Congress could do that overnight if they wanted, but it's really hard to do that administratively because there's just so many laws and rules on the books and such institutional entrenchment in the bureaucracy. So, sure, they've found a lot of, they've done a lot of good work highlighting waste, fraud, and abuse, these different kind of ridiculous spending examples. But ultimately, this is Congress's job. The president can't really do this. The courts can't really do it. It has to be lawmakers coming together and saying, hey, we're going to balance the budget for a change. And so far, neither when the Republicans are in control or Democrats in control, neither have been able to get that across the finish line. It's unclear, how many want to. I think there are people in both parties who are open to the idea, but the problem is they can't agree on what to cut. The funny thing is they probably both have to cut their sacred cows that they don't want to cut to really get this budget under control.
And this conversation is happening at the same time where President Trump wants to extend his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017. Federal taxpayers face a huge tax increase if Congress does not extend that. But of course, that comes with its own consequences if they were to extend the tax cuts, because that would even add to the federal deficit.
Yeah, that's right. So the Trump tax cuts expire at the end of this year. Now, not all of them. For instance, the corporate tax rate is permanent, but things like the child tax credit being doubled, which happened in Trump's first term, That's going to expire at the end of this year unless Congress does something. That's something that impacts a lot of people, a lot of regular Americans. And so, and of course, there's a lot of other parts of the Trump tax cuts, but the child tax credit, I think, is one of the most, has the biggest, broad impact. And so that's going to be a big tax hike on Americans, starting at the end of this year if something doesn't change. Now, it seems like they are going to make those permanent or extend them. The legislation has been passed at the initial level. They're just working out the details, but it's going to come with a big price tag. And part of the way that they justified it, in the House is they said, okay, we're going to extend the tax cuts and we're going to cut spending to offset the cost of these tax cuts. And it's like, okay, what spending are you going to cut? Well, we'll figure that out later. The committees will figure that out later. And so leadership just said, this committee, you need to cut $500 million. And this committee, you need to cut, $10 billion, and so they just assign these dollar figures to these committees to say, you need to cut this amount to find this much spending to cut to pay for the tax cuts. So we don't have the details yet of what spending will be cut to pay for the tax cuts. Of course, Republicans are going to take fire for that. Anytime you cut even the smallest amount of federal spending, this collection of people who are benefiting from it just come out of the woodwork and call you a terrible person who hates children and grandmothers and all that. And so that's coming inevitably. But right now, we don't have all the details on what spending they're going to cut. So we can't say, we don't know how they're going to try to pay for these tax cuts yet.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug, with more on the trade war with China. Now let's go back to Dan McCaleb.
It wouldn't be a week in the news business if we didn't talk about tariffs. The Trump administration says that more than 75 nations have reached out to the president and his trade team to discuss fair trade with the U.S. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, while most of Trump's reciprocal tariffs are paused as negotiations continue, the trade war with China seems to have ratcheted up. Tell us more.
Yeah, so what began as a rollout of broad tariffs for the entire world has narrowed into tariffs on China and then escalated into what many would call a trade war. I think there are signs that the trade war is actually getting colder, though. Trump has said, he told reporters this week that he doesn't want to he said, I quote, I don't want them to go higher because at a certain point you make it where people don't buy. So I may not want to go higher. I may not want to even get up to that level. It continued on. At a certain point, people aren't going to buy. And so China has also, signaled that they may not raise anymore. So, I think we do have some encouraging news on this front. Right now, tariffs are about 145% on Chinese goods. Now it varies a lot. Certain goods have specific tariffs on them. So you can't just say the tariffs are this, but the general tariffs are 145%. Of course, China has their own tariffs on us, so we don't ship nearly as many goods over there as they do. And so, both sides are feeling this. I mean, most people would say that China is feeling it worse because we import a lot of more things from them. But the degree to which China is relying on the American consumer, I think, has been a little bit exaggerated. I mean, they're definitely going to feel the pain of this. But from what I've seen, shipping goods to U.S. consumers is now, it used to be a large part of the Chinese economy, but now it's a much smaller percentage because they basically have become the manufacturer for the entire world. And so they ship to countries all over the world, not just the U.S. So the U.S., they're much less reliant just on the U.S. than they used to be. So I think they can endure this a lot longer. So this idea that we can use tariffs to totally crush China, I don't think it's true. It's more like we're pressuring them. And then I think what Trump has said is that we can get some kind of a better trade deal from them. And I think that benefits China and the U.S. to, instead of having these tariffs and escalating, let's get a trade deal that both sides feel is equitable.
So let's talk about the tariffs on the European Union. Trump says more than 75 countries have reached out to his administration wanting to talk about it. Trump from the beginning has said his tariffs, are part of a negotiation tactic to to get more fair trade for the U.S. There's been an imbalance for decades, Trump said. Do you think these negotiations are going to pan out?
Well, it's so many negotiations and, Trump's only in office 4 years. So it's going to be really interesting to see, how quickly can you really put something together? So far, we haven't seen any announced, right? And so, if there's any hope that these are just going to come together for a day or two and hammer these out, so far that hasn't been the case. Trade deals are really complicated. For the USMCA, it took a long time to come up with that. And so, I think long term, it could theoretically be more favorable for the U.S. to leverage its power on an individual basis over every country and get a better set of trade deals. But that's going to take a lot of time, I think. And so, if they don't prioritize this, I'm not sure that we're going to see it get done before Trump is out. And then if a Democrat comes in, they might just undo all of it. So I'm not sure what the long-term game here is. I think with China, it makes a lot more sense that, China does some pretty nefarious things behind the scenes. For instance, there's evidence now that Chinese companies have been providing satellite imagery to the Houthis to attack American ships. And so China's always misbehaving, and cracking down on China makes a lot of sense long term, and there's bipartisan support for that. However, cracking down on European allies and other countries for maybe marginal improvements, I don't think it has the same sort of robust backing in DC that is needed to make it more of a legacy accomplishment for the Trump administration.
And of course, there are even plenty of conservatives who are concerned about the trade war and these tariffs. A free market nonprofit law firm, Liberty Justice Center, this week filed suit against the Trump administration over the tariffs. They represent several business groups around the country, and they say that President Trump cannot unilaterally levy these tariffs, that Congress needs to be involved. So there are certainly concerns among the business community about the trade war and these tariffs.
Yeah, it's really split the right. Libertarians and some conservatives are really concerned about it. There's, free market economics dating back to Reagan and before, have been a big part of, the Republican idea. And so Trump and his version of populism have really turned it on his head. And so far, I think a lot of the lawmakers in the House and Senate are just being patient because they know that Trump can kind of change his mind quickly on things. And we've seen that with the tariffs. He implemented them, stock market slid and he said, wait, never mind. And so in a way you say it was probably wise for these Republican senators just to hold their tongue, to buy their time, because now we don't have, hardly any tariffs. We just have this trade war with China and some new trade deals. And so it all kind of worked out, I think, for a lot of, these Republican senators who opposed them but didn't say much at the time for strategic or pragmatic reasons. There is the legal question of what authority the president has to do this. I can't. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on that issue, but that's just another example of what Trump is facing questions about his authority. I will say Congress has given Trump given the president authority to negotiate and do a lot of tariffs more broadly, but negotiate treaties are part of the Senate's role, of course. So it's interesting and questioned how elaborate can a trade deal be before it needs congressional approval is an interesting question.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Why is an oil refinery in California closing in 2026? Why is the Trump administration freezing funding to Harvard? And why are housing prices here in the United States easing? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here in this week's Quick Hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The Trump administration is suing the state of Maine over its refusal to sign an agreement to block transgender athletes from competing in women's and girls' sports. Attorney General Pam Bondi said Wednesday that the U.S. Department of Justice is taking the Maine Department of Education to court over alleged violations of Title IX. Bondi accused the state and its education officials of discriminating against women. The Trump administration is weighing potential federal criminal charges against New York Attorney General Letitia James over allegations she engaged in mortgage fraud. The Federal Housing Finance Agency sent a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice late Tuesday accusing James of committing fraud. The specific accusation is she listed a home in Virginia as her primary residence and identified her father as her husband on federally backed mortgage loan applications to get a lower interest rate and more favorable terms. In that letter, the Federal Housing Finance Agency claimed that James had falsified records just before her civil fraud trial against Donald Trump and his family business on charges that he broke the law by inflating the values on his New York City properties. For the second month in a row since President Donald Trump's been in office, illegal border crossings reached record lows in March. This is a reversal of Biden administration illegal crossing totals, which were the highest in recorded U.S. history. In March, 29,065 illegal border crossers were encountered and apprehended nationwide, a fraction of what they were under the Biden administration, which averaged 250,000 in March over the past 3 years. The biggest decrease was at the southwest border, where Border Patrol agents reported the lowest average apprehensions in recorded history of 264 a day in the month of March. Utah ranks first for economic outlook for the 18th year in a row, according to the annual Rich States, Poor States report. Also noteworthy are the positive findings for Louisiana, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Arkansas. The American Legislative Exchange Council's yearly report ranks states for their economic performance from 2013 to 2023, as well as ranking them for their economic outlook based on the status of 15 economic policies set mostly at the state level. The states with the worst economic outlook, according to ALEC, are New York, Vermont, New Jersey, California, and Illinois. The Texas House passed a school choice bill after previous attempts failed in multiple legislative sessions. The House passed SB 2 and its companion legislation after 15 hours of debate Wednesday into early Thursday morning. The measure passed along mostly party lines by a vote of 85 to 63. The bill creates the state's first education savings account program to provide taxpayer-funded subsidies for primarily low-income families of roughly $10,000 per student. Governor Greg Abbott said he will sign the package as soon as it reaches his desk. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the closing of a California oil refinery, it's Keegan Kernodle.
California is losing another one of their oil refineries. What does that mean for California, Arizona, Nevada? Joining us with more on this is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, can you break this down for us?
Hey, Keegan. This isn't going to affect just people in California, Arizona, Nevada. It's going to affect every American because the plurality of goods imported into America come through California, because we're going to see huge increases in the cost of all transportation, air travel, trucking, rail, driving around. Anything that uses oil refined products is going to face a serious challenge in just the California, Arizona, Nevada region that uses California's refineries, because California is a, quote, energy island. And then everyone in the U.S. is going to pay for the higher cost of goods running through the Golden State. All of this really, though, is part of a broader push from fossil fuel into electric and possibly hydrogen-powered transportation. Unfortunately, these replacements will not be coming online by the time that California is set to lose a fifth of its oil refining capacity by the end of April of next year. We already had one refinery shutdown announced Phillips 66 is shutting down its Los Angeles refinery by October of this year. That's about 9% of the state's production capacity. Now we learned that Benicia's refinery run by Valero is going to be shut down by April of next year. When this happens, we are not really going to be able to sort out how we're going to get the replacement fuel because of a few different regulations, some national, that make it hard to ship fuel. Number one is the Jones Act. The Jones Act requires that ships going between American ports have to be American built and American crewed. America had just 5 ships on the production line in 2022. That's not completed. That's just on the production line. China had over 1,700. In other words, we just don't have enough ships to make the trips between, say, the Gulf Coast, Texas, for example, where they have a lot of refining capacity. We don't have the capacity legally because of the Jones Act to ship fuel from Texas to California. Washington State is the only other state on the West Coast that really has refineries. Oregon doesn't have any, but they only produce 243,000 barrels a day, which is less than the combined output of the 2 refineries we're losing. They already handle all of Oregon's fuel load, so they don't really have the capacity that we need to make up for our losses, which means that we would have to get the rest of the fuel from Asia or the Middle East. Now, that could also be an issue because our entire import system is designed around importing crude oil for our refineries to process. That's cheaper than importing refined products. We would have to kind of overnight figure out how we're going to build a lot of terminals at our already overloaded ports that don't function very well and figure out how to get them to handle several ships a day, pretty much, of gasoline, kerosene, jet fuel, diesel, somehow being offloaded and distributed throughout California and to the parts of Arizona and Nevada that rely on California for their fuel. In other words, it's not going to happen, and we're just not going to have fuel.
Now, this comes because of some extra legislation here in California. Governor Gavin Newsom, he's blamed the gas prices because of price gouging and stuff.
Governor Newsom went on a very public campaign when he was trying to pass his special legislative sessions gasoline and refining rules. Those did pass, but he blamed refineries for the high prices, saying that they are price gouging. His own energy department found no evidence of any price gouging. Zero evidence of that. But, he went ahead, said price gouging is why we need to the state needs to tell refineries when they can shut down for maintenance and how much inventory they have to keep on hand to smooth out the supply issues for when one of them goes down for maintenance. Well, why is it such a problem if just one refinery goes down for maintenance out of the, I believe 13 or so that we have now? Well, we only have 13. And gasoline demand is going down much slower than our loss of refining capacity. So our remaining refineries run at almost 100% of capacity. Some run over 100% of capacity, which means that if any one of them goes down because they're running pretty much, as much as they possibly can, then we have huge price spikes. We already saw that happen a few months ago when the Martinez refinery went down. Gas prices all across California and some parts of Nevada and Arizona spiked like crazy just from one refinery going down for a fire that was actually related to maintenance that they wanted to do. And so refiners said that this regulation would make it would just be more dangerous, right? The state is going to have final say over when they're allowed to do repairs. So it's not like refiners want to do repairs to keep their equipment operational, but the state doesn't want any downtime because that results in price spikes. But if you don't do the maintenance, then you're going to have even longer downtime and even worse price spikes. The other thing the regulation did, they want refineries to build massive storage containers to increase their supply for when inevitably one of these plants has some major issues and has to go down for repairs. Those are going to cost hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. in total. It's going to take years to get them approved with the California environmental permitting process. So a lot of refiners are saying we're just going to pass the cost on to consumers, or we're just going to head out. And that is what's happening. The cost of oil is very low right now, which means that energy companies are looking for ways to save money. Valero, the company that is shutting down its refinery, said that the California refineries were responsible for the low margins of their refining business. So what are they doing? They're getting rid of it. It's a liability for them. It's a huge capital expense, and they want to move on.
Thank you, Kenneth. And readers can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Keegan and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Harvard losing its federal funding, it's Eliana Kernodle.
The U.S. Department of Education late Monday said it's freezing more than $2.2 billion in federal funding to Harvard University. Joining me to dig into this is reporter for the Center Square, Morgan Sweeney. Morgan, this funding freeze comes as a result of kind of a back and forth between the Trump administration and Harvard. Can you explain what's been going on with them?
So Harvard has been under scrutiny for a few months now by the administration. In February, the administration sent out a Dear Colleague letter, or the U.S. Department of Education sent it out. And those have been used to kind of shape policy within the department for a long time. And that letter demanded that schools end racial preferencing in admissions and hiring and all kinds of internal practices. And then in March, the Department of Education sent out a letter to 60 universities that they were investigating for anti-Semitic discrimination. And Harvard was on that list. And then more recently, just last week, the administration sent a letter to Harvard demanding that they end various DEI practices, and they kind of change some of their hiring priorities, and they also end any programs that promote anti-Semitism on campus.
So then how has Harvard responded to these demands?
So Harvard has said that, of course, it doesn't want to promote anti-Semitism on campus, but it believes that the administration is violating its First Amendment rights and that it's a breach of its power, that it doesn't really have the power through Title VI to do what it's doing.
So then it was kind of in response to this that they pulled that or froze that $2.2 billion. What exactly is that money?
So Harvard, as I understand it, receives about $9 billion in federal funding, as things now stand. And the administration chose to freeze $2.2 billion on Monday because of Harvard's response to its demands, since Harvard said that it wouldn't comply.
And this is not the first Ivy that has kind of clashed with the Department of Education. Columbia back in March had a similar back and forth. What happened there?
Yeah, the administration reached out to Columbia and said that it was going to freeze $400 million in federal funding to that university for some similar reasons, but it's not entirely the same, but including the anti-Semitic discrimination. I think that was the focus. And Columbia kind of quickly said that it would comply. And so things have been fine for them since then at this point.
So on Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt held a press conference and was asked about this. What did she have to say?
Well, she was asked whether or why Ivy League universities receive federal funding in the first place. And she basically just said, yeah, that's a good question. The president's kind of looking into that at this point. And she also said that his position is rooted in common sense and that illegal discrimination has taken place on the university's campus. And so, it's kind of natural for the administration to respond like this, is basically what she was saying.
Do we know if there's any other universities that are kind of under scrutiny by the administration right now?
Well, like I said, it did send a letter to 60 universities in March about discrimination on campus. So I'm sure that other universities are being looked at. And it wouldn't surprise me to see announcements like this again in the future. But I don't believe any others have, officially seen any repercussions like Harvard has at this point.
Has the administration taken any other steps against Harvard since this happened?
Yeah, so they have announced that the IRS is looking into Harvard's tax-exempt status and might make some sort of decision there today, Thursday. And also the Department of Homeland Security has threatened to withhold $2.7 million from the university. And also now there are some questions about its international student program, which would be a big deal if changes were made to that, since people want to come to Harvard from all over the globe and will pay a lot to do so. So, interesting times for Harvard.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how this gets resolved. You can continue to follow this story at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Morgan. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the housing market is PhD economist, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, welcome back. Housing market, Q1, maybe a little soggy, a little soggier than we thought it was going to be.
I mean, look, the price growth is easing because inventory is rising, right? When we say inventory, we mean the total number of homes for sale is rising. If you have more homes on the market for sale at any given point, right, more sellers are competing for buyers, right? Buyers have a little bit more bargaining power and you get more price cuts. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now as we head into the spring home shopping season. So what's really going on, right?
That's a great question. I should have asked you that.
Part of this, like a lot of people will say some crazy things. Like I hear crazy things like, oh my goodness, buyers are pulling back. Oh my goodness, the housing market is going to crash. Oh my goodness. It's just nonsense. It's just absolute nonsense, right? Part of the reason inventories increased is because we got a surge of sellers, last month. And, a lot of sellers come on the market. They think, hey, this might be the opportunity. I've been waiting for a long time to sell my house. Okay. I'm sitting on really low mortgage payments. I've been waiting a long time because I have a low mortgage rate. But maybe I'm stuck in this little house and like, I want to move. I kind of, I want more space. Maybe some things have happened in my life, right? I got married or something, or I got another kid on the way and now I want more space. So even if I have a very low mortgage rate and very, very low mortgage payment, I might actually want to be moving. That's the first thing. So you got the surge of there's another theory out there that maybe in some markets, you got people that are facing higher insurance costs. And they're feeling the angst because things are kind of pricey now. And they are feeling desperate to get rid of that house, right? Because of the insurance costs. And here's a reason why I think this is kind of like, look, I don't want to throw cold water on people's theories, or I don't want to sound rude or anything, but look, think about it. Where are they going to move to? Right? Like, first of all, even if your insurance costs are rising, if you got a really, really low mortgage payment to offset some of that, if you got a big increase in home equity during the pandemic, you're okay, mate. You're okay. And so at the end of the day, I think that theory is kind of like a little crazy in my opinion. If you weren't one of those buyers that bought at the peak, okay, with really high mortgage rates, 7.7 plus 8% mortgage rates, you're not desperate to sell. So even if you have a slowdown in price growth currently, because you had a bunch of sellers come on the market, you know what's likely, very likely, is that these sellers are going to realize, actually, maybe there's a little softness right now. Maybe I'm just going to have to delay my move again. And so they're going to pull back and provide price support for the housing market. right? Which means prices are not going to come down. And so again, like we saw that in 2022, second half of 2022, prices were kind of falling for 6 months.
Yes.
And then they started rebounding again at the start of 2023.
Well, the market got really, really hot. I mean, and then we went through that whole like FOMO, like 2020 was a weird year, right? First year of the pandemic. I mean, you had some people that didn't want anybody in their house and they weren't showing houses. The inventory was extremely low. People were hunkered down. 2021 was like a bonanza. Like everybody wanted to move and go somewhere else. So anyway, let me fast forward to today. All right. So I get a housing update from realtors in my area, and I've received 2 in the last couple of days. Both of them like estimating like the value of my home and then estimating like the intensity, whether it's a seller's market or buyer's market. And so here's what I saw for my property. I live outside of Chicago in the suburbs. My house estimate has dropped by about 5% from I would say the peak of last summer, 5 to 7% on this range that I received. However, on the seller buyer meter, which points in one direction or the other, it had moved over the winter to very much of a buyer's market from a seller's market. Now it's pointed towards sellers pretty hard. So I mean, is this, I'm asking you this, is this a local condition that I'm seeing, or is this kind of the where?
It is kind of local, right? So the Midwest, the Northeast, with very low inventory, are sellers markets, for the most part. Places where we've seen a lot of new construction are, somewhat headed towards buyer's market. You have a lot of neutral across the country, but the U.S. as a whole has gone back into seller's market territory, according to the Zillow Market Heat Index. Yeah. By the way, you should go and download it. It's really cool. But yeah, again, you have more inventory, but I don't know in the past month, but I don't know how long that's going to last, because policy uncertainty that is going to cause, and by the way, tariffs are going to cause people to pause. And I mean, sellers might actually be like, well, if I can't get top dollars right now, I'm going to pull back.
The Trump tariffs are paused for roughly 90 days. Those 90 days run right over the top of the selling season. And like right during the, like high tide for the real estate industry. What impact do you think the tariffs are really going to have on this year's market?
What matters for housing? The labor market and income, right? So income, right? Financial wealth. So the stock market,
right?
And mortgage rates.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find great podcasts. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.